If you're ever kind of working through a problem which is kind of complex, ongoing, with no immediate solution in sight, one really helpful gospel in this regard is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. And it's a healing story, but it's kind of interesting in the sense that what's more interesting in a certain sense is what happens after the healing. And so, as a matter of background, Jesus Christ heals this man who's been suffering from leprosy. But then immediately afterwards, he says to the man, "Tell no one about this thing which has happened, except for the priests." Now, biblical scholars talk about this in terms of the messianic secret, right? And so the whole idea is that certainly there will be a time when everyone knows that Jesus Christ is the long-awaited one true Messiah, but that time is not now. And it's more of a practical consideration, right? Because if word gets out prematurely that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, it's just a lot harder for him to move about from town to town and place to place. But if you think about it, this whole episode speaks to the fact that the reason why Jesus Christ was born was not simply to suffer and die on the cross for the salvation of the world, but also to establish a church, the sacrament of salvation. And certainly there are moments where the Lord does really concrete, definitive things to advance the mission, right? And so think, for example, again, his suffering and death on the cross to bring about reconciliation with God the Father. Or think about the act of Pentecost, which is typically held to be the birthday of the Holy Catholic Church. At the same time, the way the Lord typically advances the mission is very much little by little, bit by bit. And so, for example, think about how he calls the first disciples, how he teaches them many things, how he eats with sinners and tax collectors, how he argues with the scribes and the Pharisees. It very much has this vibe recurringly of one step back, two steps forward. But the challenge and the invitation for all of us is to remember this particular gospel dynamic once we get out there in the real world, right? To remember that this is typically the way the Lord brings about the salvation of the world and the kingdom of heaven. Again, little by little and bit by bit. To further illustrate the point, I remember once talking to my spiritual director about a situation which was complicated, ongoing, with no immediate solution in sight. And I remember at the end of it, after describing the situation, basically what he said to me was, "I think you're doing fine. Like, I understand what you're saying. Like, it's difficult, confusing, no immediate solution in sight, but I still think you're doing fine." And he went on to expound upon the thing. And so basically what he said was that in a situation like yours, people tend to make one of two errors. And so a lot of people, for example, will go the way of despondency and despair, thinking to themselves that, look, I've been working the problem for a long period of time, there's no immediate solution in sight, and so therefore there is no solution. You know, shades of St. Peter, right? The calling of St. Peter. I've been fishing all night, I've caught nothing, and therefore there are no fish in that lake, right? So despondency and despair. At the same time, people tend to make, in a certain sense, the opposite mistake, going the way of forcing the issue. And so thinking to themselves, well, look, it's a matter of the mere application of effort, right? So I simply need to try harder or care more. Whereas in reality, if you kind of stop and think about it for a second, in reality, in retrospect, you're actually going the way of impatience as opposed to actually corresponding with God's providential designs. And so given all that, he proposed a third option, which is often overlooked by many people. And that's to go the way of simply managing the situation. And so again, here's a situation which is complicated, ongoing, with no immediate solution in sight. And so instead of going the way of impatience or despair, to go the way of simply managing the situation, pushing this thing along day by day, week by week, month by month, little by little, bit by bit. And my director went on to say that when you do that, when you have the patience and the wherewithal to go the way of, again, managing the situation, you're basically buying yourself time to discover what the Lord actually wants you to do, or to simply give him time to solve it all by himself. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. So I remember back in the day, I was wrestling with a pastoral situation which was ongoing, complex, with no immediate solution in sight. And I was getting kind of discouraged. And I remember coming to the end of one particular day and thinking to myself, well, gosh, I guess I'll just, pray to Liturgy of the Hours, because that's clearly something I'm supposed to do, and I can't think of anything else to do in light of the complication of my life, right? And so I remember praying with evening prayer, Liturgy of the Hours, the responsory, which was built around Psalm 23. And Psalm 23, we all know it, right? We've heard it so often, it's almost become cliche, right? So, the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. He leads me to green pastures. Now, it just so happens that same night, I was watching a movie called The Family Man, made in the year 2000, starring Nicolas Cage and Leoni. And to make a long story short, basically, it's a modern take on It's a Wonderful Life, that really famous classic by Jimmy Stewart. And so basically, the Nicolas Cage character gets a glimpse. He gets a glimpse as to what his life might have been like if he had married his college sweetheart, played by Leoni. In any case, it's a really great scene partway through the film where basically it's their anniversary. They're in this hotel room, and the Nicolas Cage character is trying to think of something romantic to say to his wife. And first of all, he kind of messes it up. And so at first he kind of looks at her and he says something like, you're beautiful. She's really polite about it, but basically the way she responds to him is by saying to him in not so many words, nice try, honey, but that didn't really do it for me. And so he tries again. And so he digs deep and he kind of says to her, all these years, I've never stopped loving you. And with that, she's breathless. And they look at each other in the eyes and they kiss and, next morning type thing. And, for me, after kind of watching that movie, after watching that scene, after, of course, praying with the liturgy of the hours, the responsory, Psalm 23, I felt like the Lord was kind of saying to me this: I am the Lord, and I am your shepherd. And so therefore, things are fine. There is nothing you shall want. And I hear what you're saying, right? You're going through this difficult time. You're going through this perhaps difficult season. But at the same time, you got to realize your life is wonderful and beautiful and amazing and rich. And even right now, I am leading you to green pastures. And in the meantime, what do I want from you? The thing that I've always wanted from you. Just love me. Just love me and trust me and surrender to my providence. And I remember, honestly, friends, once it all came together in my mind and my heart, my response wasn't especially edifying, but my response was simply to say to the Lord, oh, like it seems so obvious and yet so clear. And so it was clear. The only thing left to do was to actually surrender. And so shades of the book of Job, right? Like, Lord, before I heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And so now I repent in dust and ashes. And with that, I felt my shoulders relax. I felt a sense of peace. And with that, the courage to face a new day. And may God bless you all.